The air on the island of Guadalcanal did not merely feel hot, it felt heavy. A suffocating, tangible blanket woven from rotting vegetation, salt spray, and the kind of primal fear that clings to the skin like oil. It was the night of August 21st, 1942, and the darkness was absolute, broken only by the bioluminescent glow of fungi on the jungle floor, and the occasional nervous flicker of a match that was quickly extinguished. Deep within the defensive perimeter of the Ilu River, mistakenly identified on American military maps of the time as the Tenaru, Marine Captain John Hightower wiped a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead, his eyes straining against the black void beyond the sandspit. Beside him sat a piece of machinery that looked almost quaint, even toy-like, compared to the massive battleships prowling the Pacific Ocean. It was the M3 37mm anti-tank gun. In the grand calculus of global war, a 37mm gun was a lightweight, a quote-unquote sniper rifle for armor, designed to punch precise holes in steel plates. But on this terrifying night, Hightower and his crews were not hunting tanks. They were waiting for a human wave. They had loaded the breech not with armor-piercing solid shot, but with a canister round, a deadly innovation that was about to change the psychological landscape of the Pacific War forever. This weapon was not designed to disable vehicles. It was designed to erase the very concept of the Banzai charge. To understand the terror that was waiting in the jungle darkness, we must first step back and understand the enemy that the U.S. Marines were facing. By late 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army had cultivated an aura of invincibility that bordered on the supernatural. From the freezing plains of Manchuria to the steaming jungles of the Philippines and Malaya, the Japanese soldier had proven himself to be a warrior of terrifying discipline and ferocity. Central to this reputation was the concept of jokusai, literally meaning shattered jewel, which Westerners came to know as the Banzai charge. This was not merely a military tactic, it was a spiritual event. It was the manifestation of the Bushido code, a belief that spirit could overcome material superiority, that the collective will of the emperor's soldiers could break the morale of the soft, luxury-loving Americans. In previous campaigns, this tactic had worked with devastating efficiency. Allied troops, terrified by the screaming waves of bayonets emerging from the smoke, had often broken and run. The Japanese command, led on this front by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, believed firmly that the same thing would happen here. They viewed the Marines digging into the mud of Guadalcanal not as a formidable adversary, but as a temporary nuisance that would scatter at the first sign of the emperor's steel. However, the Americans were not relying on spirit alone. They were relying on industrial ingenuity in the cold hard physics of ballistics. The M3 37mm gun was a capable weapon, towed by jeeps and easily maneuvered by its crew. But against rushing infantry, a standard solid shell was useless. It would simply pass through one man and bury itself in a tree behind him. The solution lay in a specific type of ammunition that harkened back to the days of sailing ships and grape shot, the M2 Canister round. This was the secret weapon that Captain Hightower and the Marines of the 1st Marine Division had stockpiled. The concept was brutal in its simplicity. The M2 projectile was essentially a shotgun shell the size of a milk bottle. Inside his thin metal casing were packed 122 steel balls, each roughly 3/8 of an inch in diameter, about the size of a standard marble, but made of hardened lead and steel. When fired, the casing would disintegrate immediately upon leaving the muzzle, unleashing a cone of expanding death. Let's pause for a moment to consider the physics of this engagement. At a muzzle velocity of over 2,500 feet per second, those 122 steel balls didn't just fly, they screamed. The effective spread was devastating. At a range of 200 yards, the pattern would cover a frontage wide enough to wipe out an entire squad. It turned a precision anti-tank instrument into a giant industrial sawed-off shotgun. The Marines had positioned these guns strategically, creating interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River. They had cleared fire lanes through the tall kunai grass and strung barbed wire not to stop the enemy, but to slow them down just enough to bunch them up in the kill zone. This was the cold, mathematical calculation of modern war, intersecting with the fiery passion of the samurai spirit. It raises a question that historians have debated for decades. What truly decides the outcome of a battle? The technological superiority of weapons like the canister shot, or the fighting spirit of the men holding the line? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think technology always trumps morale? Pause the video for a second and leave your opinion in the comments below. On the other side of the river, Colonel Ichiki was making a fatal miscalculation. Fresh from victories in Guam and Midway, Ichiki was suffering from what the Japanese called victory disease, a dangerous overconfidence. He had arrived on Guadalcanal with only a portion of his detachment, the first echelon, comprising about 900 men. Rather than waiting for the rest of his forces or conducting detailed reconnaissance of the American heavy weapons, he decided to attack immediately. He believed that a night attack with bayonets would be enough to overrun the Marine perimeter. He did not know about the 37mm guns. He did not know about the canister shot. He saw only the silence of the American lines and interpreted it as weakness. At 2 o'clock hours, under the cover of a false peace, the first green flares popped into the sky, casting a ghoulish, flickering light over the black waters of the Ilu. The silence shattered instantly. A mortar barrage pounded the Marine positions, throwing sand and shrapnel into the air. Then came the sound that every Marine in the Pacific would come to haunt their nightmares. The high-pitched, rhythmic chanting of hundreds of men screaming, "Banzai! Banzai!" The first echelon of the Ichiki Detachment surged forward. They didn't use cover. They didn't flank. They ran straight across the sandbar, a bottleneck of flesh and blood, bayonets fixed, officers waving katanas, sprinting directly into the teeth of the American defense. For a terrifying few seconds, it looked like the sheer mass of the attack might succeed. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of screaming men, exploding mortars, and the rattle of light machine guns. This was the moment Captain Hightower and his gunners had been waiting for. The order was given: fire. The 37mm guns roared. The visual effect was unlike anything seen on a battlefield up to that point. Because the canister shot dispersed immediately, there was no single tracer to follow. Instead, there was just a muzzle flash that looked like a dragon's breath, followed by the instantaneous vaporization of the jungle undergrowth and the human beings running through it. The 122 steel balls, traveling at supersonic speeds, tore through the front ranks of the Japanese charge. The effect was not just lethal, it was physically repulsive. The canister shot didn't just kill, it shredded. It tore limbs from bodies, shattered rifles, and turned the charging formation into a spray of red mist and debris. One Marine gunner later recalled the scene in his diary, noting that the gun barrel grew so hot it began to glow in the dark, sizzling as the rain started to fall. It wasn't like shooting at soldiers, he wrote. It was like mowing grass. We just traversed the gun left and right, and every time we fired, a whole section of the crowd just disappeared. The Japanese, driven by their code, refused to retreat. They climbed over the bodies of their fallen comrades, slipping in the blood-soaked sand, only to be met with another blast of canister. The M3 guns were firing as fast as the loaders could shove the brass casings into the breech crack. Thump, crack, thump. The barrels were depressed to almost zero elevation, skipping the steel balls off the hard-packed sand and into the legs and torsos of the attackers. It was a meat grinder. The psychological impact on the surviving Japanese troops was catastrophic. They had expected a battle of wills. They had walked into an industrial execution. Despite the carnage, the battle raged until dawn. The Japanese survivors, realizing the frontal assault had failed, tried to maneuver through the surf, attempting to bypass the wire. But the Marines simply shifted the trails of the 37mm guns and fired into the ocean. The water turned red. By the time the sun began to rise over Guadalcanal, the invincible Ichiki Detachment had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The scene on the sandbar was one of utter devastation. Bodies were piled 3 and 4 deep in front of the gun positions. The sand, usually white and pristine, was black with powder burns and soaked in blood. The statistics of the Battle of the Tenaru are chilling. Out of the nearly 900 men Colonel Ichiki led into the attack, over 780 were killed. Most of them died within yards of the Marine lines, cut down by the relentless spray of the canister shot and heavy machine gun fire. Conversely, the American losses were surprisingly light, with roughly 40 killed and 70 wounded. But numbers alone cannot convey the horror. When patrols went out to inspect the aftermath, they found Colonel Ichiki's body. He had committed ritual suicide, unable to face the shame of such a total defeat. He had burned his regimental colors to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The sea of humanity strategy had crashed against the wall of steel and evaporated. If you are finding this deep dive into the tactical realities of World War II fascinating, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us navigate the algorithm like a Marine patrol through the jungle, ensuring more people can discover these stories. The legacy of this engagement went far beyond the body count. The Battle of the Tenaru was the first time the U.S. Army and Marines had decisively stopped a major Banzai charge in the Pacific War. It proved that the Japanese soldier was not a Superman. It proved that discipline, combined with superior firepower, specifically the devastating efficiency of the canister shot, could break the back of the Bushido spirit. The M2 Canister round became a staple of the Pacific campaign. Later, in the tank battles of the Philippines and Okinawa, tank crews would weld extra racks onto their Shermans and Stuarts just to carry more canister rounds, using them to strip away enemy infantry attempting to attach magnetic mines to their hulls. The use of the M337mm gun with canister shot at Guadalcanal marked a turning point in military doctrine. It emphasized the American philosophy of war: expend metal, not men. While the Japanese were willing to spend the lives of their soldiers to achieve an objective, the Americans were willing to spend millions of dollars in ammunition to save the life of a single Marine. This disparity in philosophy would dictate the grinding attrition of the next 3 years. The shotgun tactic used by Hightower and his men became a textbook example of force multiplication, using the right weapon at the right time to achieve maximum lethality. Today, the legacy of the canister shot lives on. Modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams still carry a variation of this round, the M1028 canister cartridge, designed for the exact same purpose: wiping out exposed infantry in the open. The technology has evolved. The tungsten balls are heavier, the range is longer, but the principle remains exactly the same as it was on that bloody night in 1942. The ghost of the Tenaru River still haunts the military manuals of today. As we look back at the Battle of Guadalcanal, it serves as a grim reminder of the collision between tradition and technology. The bravery of the Japanese soldiers is undeniable. Their willingness to die for their cause was absolute. But bravery, as Colonel Ichiki learned too late, is no match for 122 steel balls traveling at 2,500 feet per second. The green hell of Guadalcanal swallowed thousands of men, but it also forged the modern U.S. military machine. A machine built on the premise that overwhelming firepower is the ultimate answer to fanatical resistance. This story of the M3 gun and the canister shot is just one chapter in the massive encyclopedia of World War II tactics. It shows us that often the most effective weapons aren't the biggest or the most complex, but the ones that are perfectly adapted to the nightmare of the moment. We have so many more stories like this to tell. Stories of obscure weapons, forgotten heroes, and the tactical evolutions that shaped our world. If you want to join us on this journey through history, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You do not want to miss our next video where we will dissect the Japanese defense network of Iwo Jima. Subscribe now, and let's keep history alive together.